How do I use AI tooling for .NET development? I've been asked this question a bunch of times in the comments, and I finally decided to make a video where I'm going to break down my approach to using AI tooling, mainly the Cursor IDE, for developing .NET applications. So if you watched any of my videos where I touch on AI generated coding, you know that I prefer using Cursor. I pay the monthly subscription and I get pretty much all I need when it comes to AI driven development. Now I want to talk about my workflow when it comes to using Cursor, and I think this applies regardless of which AI tool you are using. Whether it's an IDE or a CLI based tool, it's only a personal preference in my opinion. What matters is the workflow that you use when interacting with AI. Now I'm going to make two presumptions when it comes to AI driven development. The first one is that you know what you want to build, and you also know how you would get there given enough time. The second one is that you treat AI as your assistant and not necessarily as a replacement for you. We won't dive into whether AI is going to replace developers or not at some point in the future. That's a topic for a different video. So given these presumptions, let's implement a semi-realistic use case where I take my application queries inside of this to-do app and I convert them from using EF Core to fetch the data and map that to a DTO into using raw SQL with Dapper. So whenever implementing something more complex than a single file, my workflow always starts with planning. Now Cursor has this handy plan mode where you can ask it what you want to build, and it's going to start out by generating a plan for this. So let's give it a prompt. It looks something like this. I want to migrate all my application queries ending with query handler from EF Core to raw SQL with Dapper in order to improve performance. We'll create a new class for fetching the database connection, and I'm being specific here that I want to use the IDB connection interface that we'll use for Dapper queries. I don't want to touch the command handlers at all. So I'm going to send this off to Cursor. Notice that I'm not using any specific AI. I just set this to auto for most cases, and I let Cursor choose whatever it thinks is the optimal result. So what's going to happen now is Cursor is going to scan my code base, check out my projects, see if I have the required libraries implemented, and at the end of it all, it might ask a couple of clarifying questions, and if it thinks it has everything it needs, it's going to go ahead and produce a plan. Now this is a Cursor feature. However, this is just a markdown document. So you could generate this with any AI tool out there. You could do this in Copilot for VS Code or Visual Studio. Ask it to first produce a plan instead of implementing any feature and output that plan as a markdown document. So what's neat about Cursor is I can now go ahead and review this document and see if I'm satisfied with everything inside. If I am, I can go ahead and click the build button and Cursor is going to proceed to generate the required code. So this is the first point that I'm trying to drive home. I don't treat AI as a vibe coding buddy. I'm being very specific with what I want it to do, and I'm asking it to first produce a plan before we dive into any implementation specifics. Looking at the plan itself, and this is something else that I think it's important, and that is reviewing the output of the AI. So in this case, it's a plan. Later, when it produces code, we're going to review the code, but first let's focus on the plan. So it wants to create an IDB connection provider, and this is going to be inside of an iSQL connection factory. There's a create connection method. All of that looks fine by me, so I'm going to go past that. Then it wants to add the Dapper package. Now I'm not sure if this is going to use central package management, so I'm going to be specific about this. Make sure to use central package management, and in the bracket I'm going to say directory packages props. So hopefully this should be enough of a nudge for Cursor to figure out what I'm trying to say here. Then it wants to migrate my query handlers, replace application DB context with SQL connection factory, remove the using statement, start using Dapper, and then it's going to rewrite my queries into the respective SQL format. Then we can touch on the database internals here if we need to change anything. And in the end, there's a list of files that are going to be modified. You can do a quick smoke test of this just to make sure that everything checks out. And let's say I'm happy with all of this. I'm going to click build. And now Cursor is going to start iterating on these to-dos. Now, if you think about it, this is how you would typically develop the project yourself. You would first plan out what you want to do, break it down into some smaller steps, and then go ahead and implement these steps one by one. So I'm essentially recreating the workflow that I use in my day-to-day work. I'm just delegating it to the AI, and I think this is an efficient approach. If anyone has a better suggestion, please feel free to leave it in the comments. I'd like to know more about how you use AI tooling. Now I'm going to wait up a couple of moments for Cursor to finish, and then we're going to take a look at the code that it produced for us. So a couple of moments later, we have our implementation in place, and we can start reviewing what Cursor has generated. So I'll begin with the directory packages props, and you can see that it specified the Dapper and the mpg-sql NuGet packages. Now I know from experience that the mpg-sql package isn't necessary because I'm already referencing it inside of my EF Core provider, which is this package here, mpg-sql EF Core Postgres. So we can go ahead and remove this. So I can go to this line of code and I can say undo. Make sure to save this. And then in the application project, I have to do the same for the mpg-sql reference. Dapper is all we need. So now let's take a look at the SQL connection factory. This checks out, just a create connection method, and in the implementation, it's fetching my connection string and creating a new mpg-sql connection. So this is probably okay. One thing you may want to do is to move this in a variable that you can return, and this just lets me open the connection before returning it from this method. Now, because I'm using mpg-sql, I want to make sure that I'm returning an mpg-sql connection. Because Cursor doesn't have IntelliSense, this is a bit harder to catch, but then again, this is something I know from experience. Now, the second thing here is that this isn't really the optimal way, anymore at least, to create an mpg-sql connection. So this is a shortcoming of AI tooling because they are trained on existing code. And not all of that code is up to date with the latest developments of a given library, mpg-sql in this case. So this is again why it's important to review the generated code. So even though this is correct, or I may even have a typo here, we're going to catch that later. What I would actually want to do is move into using an mpg-sql data source, which allows me to obtain a connection. Now I could refactor this, but I'm going to leave it like this for the time being. And let's take a look at the dependency injection setup. Instead of this being a scope function, I can actually make it a singleton because this is essentially a stateless service that just provides a database connection. So it doesn't really have to be scoped. And then if we take a look at the queries, you can see that this correctly replaces my EF Core implementation with a SQL query. I like that it's stored in a constant, and then it executes this using Dapper. There's also a using statement above where it references Dapper, and I'm going to assume that this is correct. Now, assumption is the mother of all mess ups, especially when it comes to AI generated code, but for the purpose of this demo, let's assume that this code is correct. Now, what we would actually want to do is have either a strong set of test cases that I can run on demand, and just make sure that this works as expected. Ideally, this would be an integration test using an actual database instance, which is important because we are running raw SQL. And with an actual database, I can execute this SQL against the database and just confirm that I'm getting back the correct values. If you are using something like an in-memory database, then you risk subtle bugs creeping in if you're only relying on tests for validating your code. So another thing I'm seeing here is the use of verbatim strings, where the more popular approach would be using this syntax, which lets me define a multi-line string. However, once you do this once, you can easily replicate it in your remaining queries, as the AI is pretty quick to pick up what you're trying to do. So I can easily go ahead and fix this for all of the queries that I have here. This is the last one that's missing. So let's go ahead and add that. And then let's say I'm happy with all of this. I'm going to say keep all and accept all the suggestions from Cursor, and at this point we have to ask ourselves what's next. Now that I have the code that I was looking for, I proceed to test it. Either by writing some test cases. Again, we could use AI here. It's enough that you have a couple of test cases as an example, and it can write pretty detailed test cases from my experience that are going to cover the behavior that you would end up testing yourself if you were writing the test cases. Another thing I highly recommend, and honestly I hope that this is a given, is that you're actually going to run this code and verify that it works. One drawback of Cursor is that it doesn't support the C# dev kit. So I don't have IntelliSense built in. If I were using VS Code with Copilot, then that part will be solved. But what I typically do is just switch to Visual Studio and verify my code from there. So let's, for example, check the SQL connection factory just to make sure that we got the connection name correct, and this wasn't the case. So this is something that you can easily catch if you just run a .NET build in the terminal, or you switch to Visual Studio and then build a project and then find and fix the problem. But either way, be aware that AI will not produce perfect code on the first try. However, it might get you like 90% of the way there, which is more than enough for me and provides a significant time saving to be worth it to me. If you don't want to use Cursor, that's fine. I mentioned that you have Copilot in Visual Studio with a couple of AI models you can try out. You can also bring your own model if you have an API key and implement everything I just did directly from Visual Studio. If you'd like to see me explore this and share my opinions on Copilot Chat in Visual Studio, let me know in the comments and I'm going to cover that in a future video. In my opinion, AI generated code is here to stay, and I expect it to get better with time. One thing I don't have an answer for yet is what's going to happen with junior devs, because if they rely too much on AI, they're going to fail to learn all the expensive lessons that you would have learned otherwise if you were implementing everything yourself. This comes from exploring documentation, fixing difficult problems for days, debugging applications. It's not yet clear to me how you're going to attain all those skills if you only rely on AI to produce code for you. Either way, if you enjoyed this video even a little bit, I ask of you to just smash that like button right below. Thanks a lot for watching, and until next time, stay awesome.